Hi, Adrian. Thanks for being with us. I'm just here to ask you a few questions about your book, Martyrs Mirror, Persecution and Holiness in Early New England, for our viewers at home. And so the first question is really general. How does your book change what we think we know about Puritans in New England?
It's a great question. I think part of what the book does is recaptures a sense of Puritan imaginative worlds. So we think of Puritans as being in some ways limited by the biblical canon, but in reality they had this rich sense of their own history. And this historical imagination led them to the martyrs, and the Protestant martyrs specifically, who became kind of emblems and examples of holiness. So this model of holy suffering was central to the Protestant historical imagination.
Adrian, I'm interested in this phenomenon of martyred literature, which your book deals a lot with. Fox's Book of Martyrs and the Martyrs Mirror. A lot of us have heard about that, but we're not quite sure what they are. Would you enlighten us?
Sure. So Fox's Book of Martyrs is really a whole series of collections and conversations in a way. This is a book that was compiled by many people, John Fox in some ways at the center, but also the printer John Day. And it's a collection of stories. The last volume in particular is about the stories of the Marian martyrs, the martyrs who were killed when England was ruled by the Catholic Queen Mary. So these are Protestant martyrs. And surprising everyone that there were enough Protestants, especially Protestant lay people, who cared so much about the beliefs that they went to the stake. So Fox and many others collected these stories, and then they were printed in many different editions. And one of the most easily attainable of these editions was called The Mirror of Martyrs, and so that's where the title comes from.
Your book deals with two groups that we usually see as kind of the flat-out victims of Puritan intolerance, the Baptists and Quakers on the one hand, and Native Americans on the other. And I know that in your book you have a wonderful story about a Baptist, Obadiah Holmes. His story is somewhat familiar, but with an interesting twist. Maybe you'd like to talk about that?
Sure. Well, one of the things I think is so interesting about this heritage of martyrdom is that it wasn't owned by any one group. Everyone had access to Fox's stories. And so Quakers and Baptists and Native Americans and Gortonists and all these different groups in early New England used the stories of the martyrs for their own purposes and their own inspiration. So Obadiah Holmes is an example. He was a Baptist man who went on a trip to Lynn, Massachusetts to minister to an elderly blind man there who had Baptist sympathies. And he was arrested along with his fellow travelers and eventually was whipped. And as he was whipped, he says, my spiritual experience is so great. It's as if you're whipping me with roses, as if I'm in a bed of roses. And this is language that's directly an echo of Fox's Book of Martyrs. And so we see how this kind of resistance to what he saw as unjust power is steeped in this historical imagination of martyrdom. So Obadiah Holmes, as using these stories of the martyrs in a way to fuel his own courage in resisting the Puritan magistrates.
And so how did that make his persecutors feel, to see that themselves as...
Right. Well, what we see continually is that when Baptists and even Quakers were whipped or imprisoned in colonial Massachusetts, that the Congregationalist lay people would pay their fines, and that there was an outcry. There was a real concern that, wait a minute, are we acting like persecutors, right? They did not want to be seen as persecutors because they still wanted to see themselves as the heirs of the martyrs, as part of that holy lineage of martyrdom, going back to the early church and certainly leading through the Protestant reformers.
Okay. My other question about martyrdom has to do with Native Americans and how this metaphor shaped the way that Puritans understood them.
So martyrdom resurfaces in the days of King Philip's War, which is a really important part of Native Anglo relations in the 1670s, this major military conflict between the Wampanoag and allied tribes and the English settlers in New England. So the Native Americans are burning English towns as English are burning native towns. And as these towns burn, as English lay people describe these scenes, they envision it as a kind of martyrdom. And so martyrdom rhetoric is used to understand the suffering as the war, and in some ways to elide the English people's own role as aggressors in the war, right? If you're a martyr, then perhaps you're not a persecutor or an aggressor. On the other hand, there are English magistrates, particularly Daniel Gookin, the magistrate for Indian Affairs, who want to defend the Christian natives who suffer horribly during the war. They're sequestered on Deer Island. And Daniel Gookin writes a history of King Philip's War, putting native Christians at the center and describing them as martyrs. So they then have a central place in this narrative of Christian history as a story of persecution.
So my last question, Adrian, is what your book tells us about religion in America more broadly. If you have the stage, you have our attention, what does your book tell us that we need to know?
Part of the contribution of the book is to see the history of cultural tolerance is in some ways as important as the history of legal toleration. So certainly it's important what laws are passed, certainly it's important what the position of the English king is. But I think when we're looking at how tolerance develops on the ground, especially tolerance among Protestants, so Baptists, Quakers, other Protestants, looking at the Congregationalist fear, real reticence to be labeled a persecutor when they're faced with people who are willing to suffer and have joy and cheerful countenances in the midst of that suffering. This is a very important part of the history of cultural tolerance in America.